Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program. What's the point of APA Style? Relevance of a Writing Style to Life After Graduation, which is sponsored by APA Style. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions that you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version as well as the slides. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Samantha.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sabrina, for introducing us. And thanks to everyone for joining today. My name is Samantha Denneny, and I'm here with my colleagues, Chelsea Lee and Tim McAdoo. We are members of the APA Style team, where we develop, create, and promote APA Style guidelines and products like the publication manual. We're excited to chat with you today about a question that you've probably been asked by students. What's the point of APA Style? As educators, I know a lot of you have clear ideas about the value of learning a writing style for schoolwork or even life after graduation. Librarians and educators play an essential role in teaching students to be good researchers and writers. So we're going to start by turning the question around to you. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when a student asks, what's the point of APA Style? So we'll have this poll up for just about 30 seconds, but if you have some ideas that are not part of the poll responses, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A and even upvote your favorites. So what is the first thing that comes to mind when students say, why do I have to do this paper in APA Style? Great. So awesome. So it looks like a lot of you really focus on uniformity and consistency, as well as avoiding plagiarism and paper format, which is fantastic. But we all know that for some students, APA Style can seem like something that they have to learn for their research papers, but something that won't help them much in life. So can go on to the next slide. So sometimes we see students who respond like this when they're writing their APA Style papers. As librarians and educators trying to help students become good writers, I'm guessing that you probably are sometimes confronted with some of this skepticism and resistance. We even have one of these tweets where someone would rather take their trash out, clean the bathroom, and vacuum than write their APA Style paper. So if this kind of thing is familiar to you, go ahead and let us know in the Q&A. Getting student buy-in to use APA Style and understand why APA Style matters can be a hurdle to teaching students good writing and research principles. We empathize with this problem, and we're aware of it thanks to our own market research. So we want to help you with this webinar. If that kind of sentiment rings true to you, we know that students often understand that they have to use APA Style for their research paper, but sometimes it's harder for them to envision using the lessons learned from APA Style later on in life. How can learning about citations, word choice, and formatting help them in the future? We know that the reality is only a small subset of the students that librarians and instructors are teaching every day are going to go on to an academic or publishing career. So you can't really blame them from wondering, what's the point of APA style to life after graduation? In this webinar, our agenda is to equip you with a toolkit to help you demonstrate to students how learning APA style is really about learning professional communication skills that will help students in any career they pursue. We're going to show you the core principles of APA style and how that supports communication, how understanding the reasons behind APA style can help students see the purpose of a writing style, and we're going to talk about practical applications of the lessons learned from APA style to careers in the real world. As Sabrina mentioned, we're going to end with a Q&A. So as we go along, feel free to put any questions in the Q&A box. We will get to them at the end, or maybe answer some as we go along. So let's start with the core principles of APA style so that later we can see applications of how those are relevant to everyday life after graduation. When first learning about APA style, students are often bogged down with formatting rules, or maybe they're focusing in on the specifics of certain types of citations, but all of the guidelines that make up APA style really boil down to three main tenets of APA style: clarity, precision, and inclusion. Our goal is to help students, researchers, educators, librarians, and professionals communicate in a way that allows their ideas to shine, their meaning to be understood, and to treat others with respect and inclusion. So the 50+ years of APA style development, the hundreds of pages of the pub manual, and millions of copies sold, everything we do comes down to one main goal: communication. Throughout this presentation, we're going to return to these principles again and again to show you how learning and practicing APA style with the principles of clarity, precision, and inclusion will equip students to communicate better no matter what they do with their lives after graduation. To communicate effectively, you have to communicate with integrity. Even long after you've written your last graded research paper, for most people in most jobs, they'll be working with others. There are expectations for standards of communication and behavior, whether it's a professional code of ethics for psychologists and nurses, or business ethics, or just the ethics of being part of a family. Communicating with integrity is important. So some of what it means when we say that is being able to explain yourself fully and clearly so others understand. Transparency. Using words that respect others, which is inclusive language. Providing evidence for why your ideas have merit, which demonstrates critical thinking, and backing up the evidence with sources. So what would be, citing and referencing while you're writing a research paper, we still need to back up sources or back up what we're saying with evidence in everyday communication. So providing credit due credit to others and avoiding plagiarism. And also striving for consistency in punctuation, spelling, and format, which is the level of attention to detail that's going to help people focus on what you're saying and not how it's formatted. All of these actions are going to lead to clarity. So sometimes people get very focused when they're learning APA style on certain formatting and, okay, this has to be perfect, and we need margins that are a certain size and things like that. And they think that formatting is more important than anything else. And it's really not. The goal is clear communication, and formatting is a tool of APA style that's going to help support that. An essential aspect of communicating with integrity in everyday life is choosing words effectively, making sure that the words you use are respectful and unbiased. The APA Bias-Free Language Guidelines has a really great quote. Just as you have learned to check what you write for spelling, grammar, and wordiness, practice rereading your work for preconceptions about groups of people. This aspect of communication that APA style learners practice is inclusive language. Inclusive language primarily applies to when you're talking about personal characteristics like sex and gender, race and ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, disability, sexual orientation, and so on. The primary principle with inclusive language is that when you choose words to describe others, you should call people by the language they use to call themselves. And you have to make sure to keep listening, because what language is considered unbiased or inclusive can change over time, and people don't always agree. There are significant nuances to evaluate as you decide what words to use. So APA offers some great resources to help you learn about inclusive language use, including the Bias-Free Language Guidelines and the Inclusive Language Guidelines. You can visit both of these resources on the APA style website by scanning the QR codes on the screen. And keep in mind, Sabrina is going to be sending these slides out, so you don't have to worry about capturing these QR codes right now. I'm going to turn it over to Tim to go over a few pointed questions about APA style.
Great, thank you, Samantha. So each month we receive about 300 to 400 questions via email, our Style Expert email service, and social media. And most of those are about how to cite specific sources or what to do in special cases. But a subset of those questions are from instructors and librarians who are looking for a deeper understanding of the reasons behind some of the APA style guidelines. And I think that's because you know that students who understand why the guidelines are in place will remember them better and apply them more consistently. So with that in mind, for the next few slides, I'm going to share just a few of the questions that we get. But I'll set aside some of the practical reasons behind the guidelines, like industry standards, publishing requirements, instructor needs, to instead focus just on how these guidelines benefit students in life after graduation. So first, we like to note that we don't consider APA style guidelines to be rules that are meant to shame students who don't follow the rules. And instead, they are a framework meant to make decisions easier for students and other authors as they're writing and editing their work. So we want authors to be able to focus their time on the content rather than on making decisions as they go along about formatting and layout and so on. So the style guidelines are meant to help authors write with clarity, precision, and inclusion, not to stifle an author's voice. One thing we've heard suggested is that the guidelines are in place just to test whether a student can follow instructions. But the guidelines are not really there to say that you're a bad writer if you don't follow the rules, or to provide a checklist for teachers to grade against, but rather to save the writers the work of reinventing the wheel for each decision that needs to be made along the way, like whether a number should be spelled out or written as a numeral, whether a variable should be italicized, and on and on. You as the writer, you may want to know what's best for each of those, but unless it's your subject specialty, you really don't want to spend the time researching it. You just want a good source for the answer. So over time, the APA style guidelines have been created because writers and editors have wanted to be sure their works were written clearly and concisely. Clearly because any writer wants to be sure their points are understood, and concisely because every writer has page limits or word limits. For students, that varies by assignment. And for authors submitting a manuscript to a journal, there are page limits and word counts, of course. And then readers have a limit on how much they're willing to read and how much time they're willing to spend. So whether you're writing an article or a memo or case notes or an email, being concise will make you a better communicator. We, on the APA Style team, we use the publication manual as a reference book, and we encourage others to take that same approach. So I think I saw mentioned here in the responses that it takes a long time for students to learn, but we know they'll be learning the basics first, and then the additional details if and when those become relevant as they're writing or as their writing becomes more sophisticated. So we don't expect students to know all the details the way a copy editor needs to and does know for academic journal editing. But it's good to be in the habit of looking up the guidelines and double checking your work after you've done the creative writing and editing. Sort of like you would double check yourself on a word that you know you're prone to misspell. Even if you think you've got it, you check your assumptions, and that applies well beyond just writing class paper. So one of the things that APA style teaches you how to do is cite your sources. And the way it teaches you to cite your sources is important for life after graduation. As you all know, a link that works today may not work tomorrow for a wide variety of reasons. And the internet is indeed not forever. So references include more than just links because you have to consider your reader, a skill that will be useful in future writing of many kinds. And although a student writing a class paper may think that doesn't really matter, only my instructor is going to read this paper, they're learning the skill of considering the audience and future audiences, and more to the point, learning to carefully evaluate their sources. There are reasons why the references have more than just URLs. So the additional information in references provide, to the current reader, they provide more context. So that reader doesn't have to click through each source to see the original work. They get some context right up front. And the information in the references also leaves a trail of clues for later readers to find the original source if and when the link does break. So as you write the reference, you're looking for information about the source to piece together the 4 elements, and that gives you a chance to evaluate whether this is a good source. That's a more thoughtful process than just providing a link. And so in your working life, if decisions are made in your company based on research that you do, you'll really want to know whether the sources that you found are authoritative and relevant and recent, when recency is important. So very quickly, I'm going to walk through these 4 elements with that in mind. 4 elements of an APA style reference are author, date, title, and source. The author, of course, gets, credits the original authors for the work, but also gives the readers details, for example, about who are the experts in this field. If your reader sees that you've cited many different works by the same sets of authors, it's a clue. Something else to share with students that may not be intuitive is that the order of authorship often reflects the relative contributions of the authors, with the first author being the principal contributor, and then so on. And then in some disciplines, it's the norm for the last author to also be a principal contributor. And that answers another why question about how to format references with long lists of authors that we have a blog post about that I encourage you to share with students. So that was about authorship. The date is the second element of the reference. And although not all research must be extremely relevant to be valuable, when an assignment requires recent research, the date in the reference is obviously an easy way to show that. And the author and the date are also presented with the in-text citations, right with the context of the claims or the quotes that you're making. Next is the title. The title gives the reader a very quick sense of what the work is about, and then they can decide from there whether to click through. But it's also very valuable for later readers. If and when that link is broken, an author that publishes multiple works in the same year, this may be your reader's best chance to be sure they're finding the work you actually cited. And then last is source. That gives the reader information about the publisher that they can potentially use to find the material if it's really lost to the internet. So one more thing about references. Why does it matter how the details of the reference are formatted? Italics and non-italics, sentence case and title case are the distinguishing factors. And they help a reader understand at a glance what each element is. So formatting quickly distinguishes the article title from the journal title, for example, and the volume number from the issue number. So if one of those is missing, the formatting of the number lets you know the number that you see there, which one it is. So researchers who have read through many reference lists can learn to quickly skim through a list to find the information that they're looking for. So to return briefly to the idea that the process itself of putting together the reference elements help you consider whether your source is authoritative. One example I have is that authors have asked when creating a reference for a YouTube video, whether they, do I really have to include this silly name in my reference and in the in-text citations that'll be in my paper. They were hesitant to do so because the username looks silly and they're worried that it will be distracting or make their readers question their information. And the answer is yes, the reference should reflect the reality of the source that you've used. So in this case, you may not have noticed the silly name if you just were providing a link. And so if you were not comfortable with that, it's a good chance to reevaluate whether that same information can be found in another source, or if that's really the best source for the information, then you may decide to keep it after all, but at least you've discovered it before your teacher or editor or your readers. So next is first person. No matter what kind of work you're doing in the future, you'll want to ensure that you're attributing ideas and backing up your opinions. In APA style, it's okay to use I to take credit for your own ideas and actions. Use the first person to describe what you did and what you think. So this usually leads to clearer sentences and thus better communication with your readers. We've written about this on the blog, so please feel free to share this with your students as well. But in life after graduation, it's important to know both when I is okay in your writing and then when you will need to credit only other sources. We know what teachers often, what they really want is students to avoid using I to just express opinions that aren't backed up by research, saying, I think that without giving the research to back it up. And our primary advice for students writing a paper is always follow your instructor guidelines first and then APA style second, because we're not giving you the grade. But this also illustrates another important consideration for life after graduation. There are often competing guidelines, formal and informal. So when writing at work, there may be in-house style guides that you need to follow, or there may be a combination of styles, or even definitely unwritten rules about, for example, the acceptable tone in an email is different from the tone that you might have on Teams or Slack. And here's another question that I really now love to see, and I've included it here just partially to be sure that you've heard this change in the 7th edition. From the very first edition of the publication manual and through the 6th in the early 2000s, locations were a staple of book references. And that was for good reasons that made sense at the time. But then we heard consistent feedback prior to publishing the 7th edition that the location, including location in the reference, was not really needed, and finding it was adding difficulty and time to creating references. And it makes sense. Readers are not going to the publisher to borrow the book or to buy the book. So we made this update in the 7th edition, and we've been tracking the responses to it, which have been favorable. But what this highlights is that APA style guidelines are not in place just because it's always been that way. And we aim to be flexible and adaptable with feedback we receive as things change. And your approach to the workplace after graduation will also need to be flexible, adaptable, and responsive to feedback. Finally, consistency is a principle that we come back to again and again because it applies across every aspect of a student's paper. Spelling and acronyms and data and tables and figures and headings and fonts and etc. So although you may not go on to write research papers. Attention to consistency in your work is an important skill to develop. And you'll see this principle at work throughout many of the real world applications that Chelsea will talk about next.
Thanks so much, Tim. So I'm going to finish off the webinar by talking about some real world applications of APA style, things that I think most people will encounter no matter what career they end up doing. So first, let's talk about resumes. So I think pretty much anyone's going to need to have a resume to get a job after you graduate. And while there's no APA style for resumes, so many of principles of APA style apply to resumes. For example, if you're going to be presenting your job duties on your resume, you're going to want to present them in parallel. So like the bullets of your job type of describing what you did in jobs you've had previously, you can start each of them with a verb in the past tense so that it's consistent and it makes it really scannable. You'd also want to use a legible and accessible font in a big enough size with dark enough text so that people can read your resume. The screen grab on the slide is from the movie Legally Blonde, which has the main character. She gives her resume to her law school professor, and it's pink and scented, which is a joke for the movie, of course, but sort of highlighting the idea about like, what is this sort of standard way of doing things that students are going to need to learn. And of course, for resumes, you're showing your attention to detail throughout when you're consistently having the same format, consistently using punctuation, consistent capitalization and spelling. Another common area is cover letters. Again, there's no APA style for cover letters, but the principles of clarity, precision, and inclusion still apply. Some things that would apply to cover letters would be make sure that you're addressing the cover letter or the cover email to the appropriate person and that you spell their name correctly. I think that's really important demonstration of the principle of inclusion. When you explain why you're qualified for the job, that's clarity, that's showing your critical thinking skills. And again, consistency. When you're using consistent punctuation, spelling, and format, you're showing attention to detail, which is an example of precision. Likewise, take sending emails in a professional context. It's important to use a descriptive subject line so that people know at a glance what your email is about. That's clarity. You want to address people by their name, spelled correctly, and use the person's correct pronouns if you know them, which is precision and inclusion. When you write the email, you'll want to write it in full sentences, just like you would in an academic paper, which makes sure that your sentences have complete thoughts, which is clarity. And end the email by identifying yourself, including your pronouns if you want to, so that people know how to refer to you when they reply to you, which is precision and clarity. Here are some more applications of clarity and precision. First, take word choice. So when you're writing anything, you have to choose words that mean what you think they mean, much like this famous scene from the movie The Princess Bride, in which impossible things keep happening and this character keeps responding, inconceivable. And then another answers, you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. So as much as you can, you need to make sure that you're choosing the correct word. The dictionary is great for that. Also, as much as you can, you want to choose words that other people are going to understand, which is commonly called plain language. A major part of APA style talks about avoiding jargon, which is highly technical vocabulary that only people really experienced with a topic area are going to understand. And that's, I think, really common as you get more and more experienced with a topic area, you start to forget that others don't have the same context that you do. Another example of using plain language others will understand has to do with abbreviations. APA style recommends that you don't create abbreviations that are unfamiliar to readers. Like maybe if you're going to use them frequently, yes, that's valid, but it's easier for readers to process abbreviations that are familiar to them, so that are existing. So using the abbreviation for ADHD, most people would probably know that. But if I'm making an abbreviation for I don't know, color theory and I write CT everywhere, that's not necessarily at top of mind. And so focusing on the words themselves is going to help readers understand what you're going for. I think another issue is that when you're writing sentences, you want to prioritize using the active voice so that people understand the logic of who is doing what. It's like when people say mistakes were made. Well, by who? Who made them? And it's about showing who's controlling the action, which is going to lead to clearer communication. And in science fields, especially like psychology and nursing, showing where actions are coming from via use of the active voice is a really important technique for communication. Now let's talk about some principles of inclusive language use. Plenty of those when you're on the job. One of my favorites is when you're choosing names for examples or for fictional characters, don't always choose the most common Western names like John and Jane and Smith and Jones. It'd be cool to choose diverse names. It'd be good to choose names that represent the people who you're working with. Some good ways to get ideas are to look at reference lists of published papers, or like scanning lists of names, like top baby names from different countries are great ways to get inspiration. It's always so exciting to, you know, see a different name in there to show that we're all, you know, part of the progress of society. Another example of inclusive language application is when you're choosing stock images or graphics. I think it's really important to inspect the stock images that you choose to look for unintended bias. Like what race and ethnicity and gender and age are being represented. Because remember, if you choose one thing, by necessity, that means that you're not choosing something else. And people are noticing. So it's important to choose images that represent the people you're working with, or you could try choosing images that don't include people at all, but are more about the concepts that you're dealing with. And that can be a good strategy to avoid unintended implications. Another thing with inclusive language is to be aware of common sayings that maybe they used to be acceptable, but nowadays can be considered pejorative or appropriative. For example, when I was little, it was very common to say gypped when you meant cheated, or to say something like, the eagle is my spirit animal, when you meant, I love eagles, or I identify with the qualities of eagles. APA's inclusive language guidelines, which Samantha mentioned earlier, have tons of specific examples like these. And by paying attention to appropriate language use, you'll ensure that you're not offending others, but rather communicating clearly. Next, I'm going to talk about choosing your font. So whether you're choosing a font for an email or for a poster or for a PowerPoint presentation, it's important that you use something that's accessible, which means legible and widely available. So in the 7th edition, APA Style changed its recommendations from requiring Times New Roman 12-point font for all text to just recommending an accessible font. So I had a real world encounter with font problems last year when I got an email from my son's elementary school teacher, and she was sending all the emails in Comic Sans, and they looked fine on a web browser, but it was really, really hard to read on a phone. And it turned out the Comic Sans, which, as you know, is really popular with educators, isn't available on all devices. And when it's not available, the system substitutes this script font that you see on the right-hand side of the slide, which is practically illegible. And at first I thought maybe I should just read the email on my laptop. Does this really matter? But then I thought, again, I think there's an issue of equity here. For example, research says that lower income families are more likely to be using a smartphone to access the internet than to have a desktop or laptop computer at home. And on top of that, at least in the school my son is at, a lot of the lower income families are also immigrants who are English language learners. So that means the people who are facing the most hurdles to communication are encountering this illegible substitute font when they try to read the emails on their phone. So I ended up sharing these screenshots with the teacher, and she was like, she had no idea. And she started using a standard font in her emails, which led to improved communication. Color is another important area for visual communication, and APA style teaches you how to use color effectively to convey meaning. Take a look at this graph that I found online, and you'll see problematic use of color. So this graph is meant to show the number of scientific papers published by year, by field, according to some open source data. Some of the sections are labeled directly on the graph, like medicine and computer science, and that's fine. But the smaller bands of color have a key, but then in the key, the colors are repeating. And I think it's meant to be that you go in order from left to right, reading down the columns, and that it matches up with the colored bands going up from above psychology. But like the choices here are putting significant impediments on communication. And this graph would be a lot more effective if all the colored sections were directly labeled off to the right. And of course, if you're looking closely, it would also be better if the years on the x-axis didn't have commas in them. So I think if the creator of this graph had followed the recommendations from APA style, they would have chosen colors people can differentiate. They would maybe have used a strategy of combining color and labeling or color and pattern. And this way, people who are colorblind, or even people who printed out the image on a black and white printer, would still be able to understand the meaning. Here's another example showing the importance of labeling everything in a graph. So apparently this graph was used in an investor presentation to the company Britannia to describe market share. But look on the y-axis, there are no numbers. So we see that Britannia's market share has increased and the market share of the largest competitor has decreased, but it's impossible to know how much difference there is. So when you create graphs, APA style provides great directions showing what needs to be labeled and how to label it to make sure that your communication is clear. Here's another graph demonstrating the importance of scaling your data appropriately. So this graph is meant to show average male height in meters for people from 6 different countries. But let's look at the axes. So the y-axis starts at 1.5 meters, which is like 4'11", when it should be starting at 0. And then the creator of this graph used images of people rather than standard bars. So the people's feet are starting at 1.5 meters, and then the people are scaled proportionately. And so the graph ends up giving the impression that men in the Netherlands are 3 times as tall as men in the Philippines, when the difference is actually about 8.5 inches. So on top of that, even if the images of the people had been scaled properly, I think there's still questions of inclusion here. Because in addition to the obvious issues of skin color selection, do we really want to send the message that every man in Canada is a lumberjack and every man in India wears a turban? Do these stereotypes really help? I don't think they do. And so even if you're trying to be cute, you can unintentionally wade into stereotypes and bias. And APA style teaches you to be aware of that so that you can focus on communicating what you need to communicate. I'm going to end my set of real world examples on a positive note. So a friend of mine is a nurse and she used APA style in school to write her papers. And after she graduated, she was working at a hospital and she used the principles of clarity, precision, and inclusion to make a difference at her hospital during the pandemic. She noticed the nurses were struggling, and using clear communication, she convinced management to let her create a resilience room for hospital staff to be able to detach and relax from the stresses of caring for people during the first wave of the pandemic in the spring of 2020. So she had to have an organized plan. She had to clearly communicate her needs in writing and provide evidence for why the room was needed. She had to explain and justify the costs of the supplies. And then when she made her signage, she even explains the room isn't just for nurses, even though she's a nurse, but it's meant for all staff. So even though my friend, the nurse, isn't writing papers anymore, the skills that she learned and practiced in school ended up making a real difference for others. So now I'm going to turn it over to Samantha, who is going to facilitate our question and answer period.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chelsea. And we've had some really good discussion going on in the Q&A. But first, do you mind just going to the next slide? So some of the questions that have come up have been about things like what kind of resources are available from APA? And we have a couple of things here. We have the APA style website, which has a lot of free information that you can link on your live guides, that you can direct students to, that'll help them understand the major elements of APA style. So if you have a second, there's a ton of free information on our website that you might find really useful. We also have a really fantastic tool called Academic Writer that helps students through the writing process. They can actually put their own references in Academic Writer and use them as they write in APA style. And we also have the Mastering APA Style Student Workbook, Publication Manual, and Concise Guide to APA Style. And of course, our APA Style social media. So you might be aware, if you're on Twitter or Instagram, you can actually tweet us your APA style questions and we'll answer those. So the first question I would like to address is one that we've been thinking about a lot lately. So there have been queries about ChatGPT. How do we cite ChatGPT? What do we do with this new technology? Tim or Chelsea, do you want to respond?
Sure. I mean, yeah, we've gotten quite a few and on from a variety of different viewpoints on that. So we're collecting data. We do have thoughts about it, but we want to make sure we get everyone's feedback. We can share a link in the chat to the a Twitter thread we've got on that, and it's been very interesting to collect this feedback. And if you have thoughts, please do send those to us in the style expert email or on social media. Go ahead.
This is something that we don't want to kind of make a recommendation before we explore all elements of it and talk with experts. So please join the conversation. We've got a conversation going on in Twitter, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So Janice says, why is figuring out APA style harder than writing the paper itself? So Chelsea, do you mind taking that one?
Oh, thank you for sharing that sentiment. I think that there are a lot of components to APA style, and that can make it feel overwhelming. On the plus side, we have so many resources on the APA style website that can help you if you're having to write a paper in APA style. So on the website, I would recommend visiting our instructional aids page, and we can put the link into the Q&A so that you can see it. We have several specific resources available. One of them that I think is great if you're brand new is to take the basics of 7th edition APA style tutorial that walks you through the whole thing so that you can understand what you need to accomplish. We also have a webinar we gave, a step-by-step guide for APA style student papers that is specifically focused on this student experience. Additionally, on the instructional aids page in the handouts and guides section, we have checklists available that you can use if you're writing a student paper that can help you make sure that you've addressed all of the areas that need to be addressed. So so we have those resources that exist. And another thing I wanted to add is that the resources often come from the community, from other librarians and other educators. So if you have something that you've developed to work with students that you think is really effective, we would love to hear about it. And it's possible we will be able to work with you and put it available on our website for others to be able to benefit from. I'll go pop the links to those guides and tutorials I mentioned in the chat.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. So Edward asks, why can't APA style be disseminated for free? Other academic writing and citation styles are freely available. So I'll take this one. So as Chelsea mentioned, we have been consistently adding to our website. So go ahead, take a few minutes on the website sometime today. We have a number of fantastic instructional aids and elements that can be used for free. In terms of our publication manual, our concise guide, and other paid products, those are all important elements of our publishing division, which really allows for us as a nonprofit to be able to support the overall work of APA, including things like our governance division, our science division, things like that. So another question we have, Madeline asks, formatting is sometimes overemphasized by classroom instructors. So how can I, as a librarian, help to shift the emphasis? Chelsea or Tim, would you like to answer that one?
I certainly have one idea to start. I think that the better place to focus obviously would be on the content, making sure that the ideas are sound and that the students are demonstrating critical thinking. We have a great activity on our website in the instructional aids section about, it's the research article activity, and I'll link it for you all. And it walks you through the process of getting your source, figuring out what the citation should be, but then evaluating the source, analyzing it. Things like figuring out what's the topic of the article and how to analyze the method section of a research paper that's reporting research, how to understand the conclusions of the research, how to understand strengths and limitations. And then it walks you through how to paraphrase it and summarize the article. And so I think that is a great way to bring focus to the act of reading and analyzing and then writing about research. And it's not got anything to do with how big your margins are in your paper. Tim, did you have any other thoughts about that question?
Not that I can improve on that. No, just that also the other types of handouts we have there talk about transitions and things that are not just about references. APA style, it does include the bias-free language guidelines and other aspects that students should focus on.
Great, thanks guys. Both Christopher and Hannah are asking about is there a briefer form of the manual that covers only the basics for novice students? And that's a really great question. We have a couple of different options for you. The first is, we mentioned the website. There are things that you can link from there, including a nice getting started guide for APA Style 7. And we also have the concise guide to APA Style. So if you're working with undergraduate students who are going to be, they're not going to write something for publication, they're primarily using, undergraduate papers, it's going to focus on the elements that they need to work on instead of, everything that's in the publication manual. It's also, we try and keep our products very affordable as well. So it might be a good option for some of your undergraduate students. Okay, so one question we have is, can students use both parenthetical and narrative citations in the same paper? Chelsea?
Yes. That's such a neat, I like that question because the answer is so straightforward. Absolutely. Parenthetical and narrative citations, absolutely. You can mix and match and use whatever one makes the most sense for the sentence that you're writing. A narrative citation is the one where the author's names are part of the sentence. And that's really good when you're wanting to describe research that occurred and who did the research. A parenthetical citation would have the author and year of the work only in parentheses. And in that case, you might use a parenthetical citation if you're wanting to more focus on the idea, and then like where it comes from is less important to emphasize for the reader. But absolutely, published authors use both style of citation, and students should too.
Here's an interesting one. Carrie asks, do we know if APA has a stance on using profanity or obscenities in qualitative research where you might be quoting verbatim?
I actually know the answer to this one too. This really happened. Someone contacted the journals department. They were publishing research about the experience of Asian Americans during COVID, and that they were experiencing racial discrimination. And the paper included all of these epithets and obscenities. And they thought, like, should we be putting these in the paper? And what we told them was that your paper, so in this case, the paper was about biased, obscene language. We said that you should establish for readers what is the topic so that they kind of know what they're getting into. And then when the language comes up, that you should present it as it was. In this case, it was a study, and the offensive words were stimulus words, and that you should present them and not censor them or try to talk around them. Because it's important for clear communication, especially in science, to say the word that you mean. So I think maybe it would be a little bit different if your paper wasn't about obscene language and then a participant happened to swear while they're saying about whatever they're talking about. But certainly there's not a blanket no swear words allowed kind of stance.
Great. Tim, do you have anything to add? I saw you nodding.
Nope, that's nothing to add.
Great. Cecilia asks, in the ProQuest database, it provides both standard APA and APA annotated citation. Can students use either one? I don't know if you're familiar with either of those, those differences.
I'm not.
So the publication manual does have an example for an annotated bibliography, if that's what the question's about.
Yeah,
So
I think that one is one that we might have to have you ask ProQuest. Maybe they have a good reason for having both APA and APA annotated.
Yeah, or email us at styleexpert@apa.org with the example, and we'll get back to you.
Great. So Megan mentioned, isn't Comic Sans used because of dyslexia? Is there a font that's still accessible for that? And I certainly don't know the answer, but Chelsea and Tim, have you come upon that, or maybe we need to take that to our...
There's been a few fonts developed specifically for people with dyslexia. One of them is called Dyslexy. And to be clear, I'm not saying that Comic Sans isn't accessible. It was the way in which it was used. So it was used in an HTML encoded rich text email that I was reading through the browser on my smartphone. And so it was that specific use case that it got translated into this garbly sort of script font. If you had presented the information in a different way where the look is preserved, it would have been a totally valid choice. For example, if you had presented it as a PDF, which obviously keeps the look of whatever font that you choose, then that would have been a great choice. So I think the lesson is more about knowing the modality that you're communicating in and making sure that the font that you choose is going to be displaying correctly for people, no matter how they're accessing the information.
Thanks, Chelsea. And it looks like we have a tiny little debate going on. It's very interesting. In the Q&A, using initials for authors given names versus writing out the full names. It sounds like there are some differing opinions there. Bruce says, using initials for authors given names strikes me as a quaint practice carried over from printed pages space limitations that don't apply online. Full names, if available, reduce ambiguity among similar author names. Conversely, we do have some people in the Q&A as well who prefer the initials. So Tim or Chelsea, can you provide a little more insight as to, why the call was made to focus on initials?
So that is one case where it has been that way for previous editions, and we did discuss pros and cons, and we had similar sorts of feedback. And I think that one of the reasons we kept it was that we saw more reasons to keep it than to change it. But there are those. There is value to having the name spelled out, but Chelsea, do you have additional thoughts? I'm just
there's definitely valid points for both ways of doing it. We also heard the opposite perspective, that people weren't wanting to have people thinking about, oh, what gender is this person by reading their name, and that having just surnames skips over that. Just surnames in the reference, because of course the paper itself will include the person's full name most likely. So it's definitely something that we have heard and are definitely still like gathering the information to figure out like what's the best road forward for the future.
I mean, it did start, I think, or at least one of the reasons was a space limitations thing, but those are still concerns even online. There are still page counts and word counts and character counts.
Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. So what drove the decision to move away from a preferred typeface? Legibility seems highly subjective, and naming a preferred typeface or two seems to provide helpful consistency. What do you guys think about that? From Joe.
Great question. We do recommend some typefaces. You can find those in the fonts section of the manual, as well as on the page called fonts, I think, on our website. So we recommend several fonts that are safe choices. Part of the reason we moved away from Times New Roman 12-point font all the time is even when you only pick one font, people still complain and find reasons against Times New Roman, and that allowing the flexibility to have a font that makes sense for the context that you're delivering your work in is good. Another important thing is that when you go to write a paper in a word processing program, it's really nice not to have to change all the settings. And so we adapted our guidelines for the 7th edition so that you would have to change as little as possible when you open Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever you're going to be using to write your paper. So like if in Word, Calibri is the default font, like you don't have to change it. You can just write it in that. And so we felt like that was sort of a good middle ground of providing recommendations while still saying there are lots of good options out there.
Great, thank you so much. It looks like we just hit 3 o'clock. Sabrina, should we answer a couple more questions or wrap it up? What do you prefer?
If you want to answer a couple more, maybe 2 more max, and then we can wrap it up. I don't want to take too much of everyone's time.
Absolutely. So last questions. So Zena mentions, in light of data fluency trends such as dashboards, infographics, and other data visualizations, will APA style guidelines clarify citations for those objects in the next update?
That is a great idea. We do have examples on our website for infographics. The goal with any reference is that you want to provide the author, date, title, and source. So if you can figure out those, then that's the reference that you need to, that's the rest of the reference that you need to do. The person who asked the question, if you would send us examples that are what students are using that you've seen used to our style expert email, which is styleexpert@apa.org, that would be awesome because we can add those examples to our website.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chelsea. And to everybody who asked questions, we still do have a number of questions. If you have APA style questions, feel free to check out our website or our style email address. So we have a member on staff who's able to answer style questions. So please don't hesitate to reach out to styleexpert@apa.org. And thank you all so much for this great conversation. We're so happy that you decided to join us today.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Samantha. And thank you to Chelsea and Tim. Thank you, all of you, for presenting. And thank you to our attendees for your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording, as well as where to access today's slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the session, and we hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.